All right. Well, why don't we begin? If that's okay with you all?
Yeah.
Um, all right. So I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then I'm going to pass it over to Chad. But thank you everyone for coming to this CIRCA hosted webinar series. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and it will be posted to our website in a few days. At the moment, as attendees, however, you do not have the ability to use your audio or video. However, when we get to the discussion portion, we will turn that feature on for you all. In the meantime, you can post, I believe, questions in the chat that Libby will get to when we get to that portion of the webinar. Just briefly, my name is Kurt Mayland. I work in energy resiliency at CIRCA. And with me is my colleague, Libby Duskin. And Libby, do you want to give a 2-second intro to yourself?
Yeah, I'm Libby Deskin. I am the data analyst and programmer at CIRCA.
Great, great. And I have a very annoying little Milo, my dog here, who's a lap dog. So you'll see him from time to time. So this series is a continuation effort after our research symposium we held a few months ago and research seed grant, and is aimed at showcasing the research efforts of UConn faculty members and fostering collaboration within the university's community. Each webinar will center around one of the 4 research areas outlined by CIRCA, accessible on our research interest areas website. And today's webinar will focus on decarbonization and energy and biodiversity ecosystem and conservation. And will highlight Dr. Chad Rittenhouse. Dr. Rittenhouse is an associate professor in residence in the Department of Natural Resources and the Environment and the director of the MEME program, and that makes him my supervisor. Chad's research works at the intersection of science and management as it relates to conservation planning, decision making, and landscape and wildlife ecology. And as long as that's an okay intro, Dr. Rittenhouse, I will pass it along to you. I think
That's
you, yep, there you go.
yeah, that sounds great. Thanks, Kurt. And anyone who knows Kurt knows that he's his own boss. So I appreciate you introducing me as that. But um, I want to begin by thanking everybody, Kurt, Libby, for this opportunity and others involved in this effort. I've long known about CIRCA. This is actually one of a very small handful of my interactions, and what I hope is the first of many more meaningful interactions with this group. And I just took a peek at the attendee list, and I got to give a shout out to some of my MEEM alums. And the attendee list went away, but I remember seeing Alexis, Seth, and oh, who's the last one? Let me bring that back up because I don't want to miss any names. Kayla, the unforgettable Kayla. So thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to share my screen now, and bear with me. It's always fun to share a screen with PowerPoint and make sure that you're on the correct presentation screen. So let's see if we can get this to happen the first time. On my end, I'm just seeing the slide in presentation mode. Is that what everybody else is seeing? Great. Okay, so I'm going to speak briefly on this topic. Thanks again, Kurt, for saying it. It's a mouthful. What I'm going to focus on is my approach to it, and I call it the plan approach, the people, land, and nature. So let's jump in. Assuming that this keyboard will work to advance my slides. My screen seems to have locked. This could be a very interesting presentation if I'm only stuck on the first slide.
Take your time. You can, if you have to reboot,
Hey,
we
here we
can
go.
be patient.
Now
Yeah.
we can do it. All right. So when I'm wearing my MEEM director hat, I advise about 100 students in pursuit of energy and environmental management from a lot of different angles. When I'm wearing my research hat, this is what I think about: the relationships between people, land, and nature, and specifically trying to understand those with a goal to enhance stewardship and decision making on both public and private lands. This figure is kind of the conceptual map for what I and my research team do. This was originally developed by Ava Smith, and in the next segment, I'm going to highlight her master's thesis research quite a bit more. But very briefly, the colors kind of organize this into groups. And the light blue is forest owners. The darker blue are all of the different conservation organizations and tools and support mechanisms that try to engage and support forest landowners in conserving forests. This is through the lens of Ava's work, but as I'll illustrate a little bit later in the talk, this applies to any kind of a planning process, be it conservation plans, environmental plans. On the far right in green is the system of interest. In this illustrative example, it's forests. So we think about things like forest threats, current forest conditions, and desired future forest conditions, as well as what those conditions might be if no actions are taken. So with that framework established, let's talk about people and the land. So many of you know a good swath of the US is forest, and of that, a good swath of it is private forest. Some Forest Service research from CIRCA 2018 indicates that there's about 9.6 million families, individuals, land trusts, or estates that collectively make up what we call family forest and woodland ownerships. They own a lot more of our forests than any other group, including the federal government, corporate interests, state, tribal, and local entities such as land trusts and towns. So in our estimation, that's a pretty important group to put some attention to. Excuse me. So what does the literature say about forest owners, and specifically family forest owners in particular? So Ava Smith was a master's student who worked with me from about January 2000 to May of 2022. Her master's thesis was focused on understanding the state of knowledge and research of private forest owners. She conducted or developed a systematic map, which you can think of as a very extensive literature review, and focused on the northeastern United States from 1990 to 2020, so about 30 years of perspective here. And she's interested in this inverted triangle here, this progression from people's values, which tend to be few in number, slow to change, and very central to their beliefs and mostly transcend situations. So something that's always held, on up to their behaviors. And in this case, we're interested in behaviors of forest landowners as it relates to forest management planning processes. What she found in an initial screening of more than 2,000 peer-reviewed journal articles, and through that screening process, which included factors like we want it to be New England specific, we want it to be private forest owners, she settled on a set of about 80 to 90 papers. And I'm going to present her results of that systematic map of those 80 to 90 papers. With respect to themes, timber harvest dominates the literature, far and away. Over 40 of the papers were focused on or mentioned forest management and specifically timber harvest. A handful of other papers examined things like landowner characteristics. Who are we trying to work with and engage? How are we doing that through forest conservation and outreach programs? And what are motivating factors for landowner decision processes? What you'll see not necessarily represented in these themes or even the sub-themes is where does energy fit? We'll get to that in a moment. Here's the long list of, well, I should say partial list of some of the keywords that Ava was looking for, broken down by states. And what she's done here is color-coded, and the darker orange color is the higher frequency of mention. The light blue is the least frequently mentioned, and if there's a white spot, it wasn't mentioned at all. And I want to draw your attention to a couple important things here. First of all, carbon is not really very well represented in the scientific literature yet. Current forest conditions are equally underrepresented in the literature, and anyone who's walked around in the forests of Connecticut know that we're undergoing a tremendous amount of change in our forests right now, from emerald ash borer to spongy moth, hemlock woolly adelgids, and most recently, just in the last 2 years, the beech leaf nematode, which, at least for the areas that I'm familiar with, has completely wiped out beech trees from young to old in the last 2 growing seasons. Also, the literature gives some attention to future forest conditions. If we map all of those papers and try and understand, how are these things related as it pertains to our conceptual model, what we find is that there are many relationships. And here, it's a little hard to distinguish, but the numbers on the screen represent the number of papers that connect these individual topics. And we tried to do the thicker the line, the stronger the relationship, but our graphics software didn't always cooperate in that regard. So I'm going to draw your attention to one focal point, and that's forest plans. And if we take a deeper dive into forest plans and look at what they're connected to, we find something that's really, really surprising. With respect to carbon, current forest conditions, and funding, and I've highlighted those 3 things in orange, that's where we find the majority of our statistically significant relationships as it pertains to forest plans. So what does this mean? This means that the literature's focus on, for example, the left-hand side in 11 o'clock, landowner experiences, policy tools, timber harvest, those are not necessarily the most strongly linked factors with landowners actually engaging with forest professionals and developing a forest management plan. Rather, it's the ones in orange, the funding, the current forest conditions, and carbon. Now, if you remember from the previous slide, carbon was really underrepresented in the literature, but what this analysis indicates is it's very strongly correlated with motivating factors and positively for landowners to engage in a forest management planning process. And contrary to what many people think, estate planning had a negative but statistically significant correlation with forest management planning. So as our current forest landowners are aging and their demographic is predominantly 50 plus, primarily Caucasian and primarily wealthy, estate planning is not driving decisions about their land. And that could be already because they're intending to pass it on to heirs and they're not necessarily concerned about forest management planning processes, or it could be because they know the land will be sold and potentially subdivided into additional development opportunities. I got to bring my cursor back. Hang on a second. There it is. Which brings me to step 2 of these vignettes. And so what's happening with our forests in Connecticut? So enter Mari Cullerton. She just finished her master's thesis this current May of 2024. Mari's research was focused on mapping large-scale solar installations from satellite data. And she did that to help us understand what are the impacts to land cover of what's called energy sprawl. So the energy infrastructure and development that's associated with not just renewable energy, but all energy development. And there's a couple aerial images here that illustrate on the left column Sprague, Connecticut, original condition in October 2016, conditions during development in that middle row, and then finally what does that build out look like for a large-scale solar panel array. Mari did a really sophisticated remote sensing analysis of satellite imagery. This is the workflow. I'm not going to go into detail, but suffice it to say, it was a lot of imagery. It spans about 2016 to 2023, and she was looking using some very sophisticated computer algorithms to do time series analyses of those images to try and identify when were solar panels installed, and then retroactively generate what was the land cover type prior to installation. So I'm going to provide just a little bit of peek, not at the workflow, but at some of her results here. Circa June 2021, when Mari completed the first statewide mapping effort, this is what she identified as the large-scale solar in Connecticut. And those the black blobs indicate both the location and the approximate array extent of the solar development in Connecticut. So that very sophisticated modeling approach worked in part because although it's very challenging to detect when a solar array gets installed using satellite imagery, if you work from present time backwards in time and you establish that, okay, the solar array is here, when was that particular place on the ground showing fluctuation in spectral values that might be associated with forest vegetation or agricultural fields growing and senescing and getting covered by snow and so on and so forth. Working backwards through time helped make these solar arrays pop. To get to the land cover change piece, it took Mari a solid year to develop this, and then the application of it, she realized, sorry, here's an example from 2019, that her map was already out of date. And so she redid all of the work that she did, such that by September 23, everything that's in yellow is a new site that was developed since her original map in June 2021. So this is a very active and dynamic phenomenon that's happening in Connecticut here. Large-scale solar arrays are going in real time. Well, let's take a look then at where those are going. And what Mari found, I need to move my little speaking window here because it's covering up part of my slide. What Mari found is that predominantly those solar arrays are going on agricultural fields and forests in Connecticut. The forest part is not necessarily surprising when you consider that about 65% of Connecticut is forest. The agricultural field part was a little surprising, in part because a large proportion of those agricultural fields actually correspond with the state's and USDA's prime farmland soil maps. And so some of these solar arrays are going in places where the state and federal agencies has identified this is really good soil for farming. And there's some acreages here and some indications of when these developments were happening. And if you draw your attention to 2018 at the bottom of the x-axis there, you see a lull in the installations. And that actually corresponds with some legislation within Connecticut here that was trying to put a little bit of limits around this loss of prime farmlands and working forests. But the effect of that legislation was short-lived. It primarily resulted in the size of these projects being downgraded to be below the level and escape some of the issues of the siting process on prime forest lands and forests. I got to find my mouse again. Where to go? There it is. Mari then worked to unpack some of the potential drivers of where the solar development is happening. And as any of you know that work in this field or adjacent to it, a big driver is we've got to have the transmission lines. You've got to interconnect, you've got to be able to deliver this energy to and throughout the grid. And so one of the main drivers of where these solar arrays are going is where the transmission lines are. And here the darker colors indicate the higher proportion or the higher amount of land that's been converted into solar arrays since about 2016. So Tolland County and New London County are lighting up the map here. Fairfield County and Middlesex County are on the lower end of this development spectrum. Mari also took a look then at some of the socioeconomic patterns. In the top left is that figure I just showed you. I just pulled out the removed the transmission lines to make this a little bit easier to see. And what she found here in looking at relationships with median household income as well as a social deprivation index score or SDI is that in counties with more large-scale solar, those counties also had lower household income and that's in the top right panel here. The lighter pink indicates lower household income, and then in the bottom left, the lighter orange indicates lower SDI score. And I think that scale might be backwards on the social deprivation. My apologies for that. But suffice it to say, where we see large areas of solar development happening, that correlates very strongly with counties that have low median household income and high social deprivation index. So in other words, it's not going where rich people live, which would be Fairfield County in particular. The third vignette that I want to share with you today, and also the final vignette, is contemporary work that's happening right now in real time with Katie Bischoff, a PhD student who's working with me. She joined the plan team about last year, January of 23. Katie's work is primarily looking at the Connecticut Wildlife Action Plan revision, and specifically developing habitat suitability maps for species of greatest conservation need in Connecticut. This is hot off the press modeling work that Katie has done, in this case for frosted elfin. So I'm going to share a little bit with you a story about frosted elfin. So for those of you who may not be familiar with it, a frosted elfin is a butterfly. It's associated with a very specific host plant and a very specific set of habitat conditions, primarily barrens or old fields and sandy areas. And surprise, surprise, our energy footprint is a good bit of what we've identified as the suitable habitat for this species. So here, the dark red colors indicate the relative habitat suitability, and then the blue colors indicate zero, functionally zero habitat suitability, and anything that's white here is a water body. But what we can see coming from the top left to the bottom left of the screen, those snaking red lines and with some orange in them, those are transmission corridors. So our energy footprint is habitat for wildlife, at least for frosted elfin and a small handful of other species that we'll be looking at and building these maps out further. So I just gave you a whirlwind tour of some of the contemporary research that my research team has been involved in. And to bring it back to the beginning of this presentation, where I talked about how we're interested in the relationships between people, land, and nature, what I hope I've illustrated, albeit quickly, and I'm very happy to go back and provide more explanation or insight into various steps of the processes that Ava, Mari, and Katie have contributed to this, is that our energy infrastructure and solar development are in real time impacting and influencing people's decisions and stewardship of land and nature. And there are biological implications of this work. And so what this work has collectively helped me understand and reinforce is that we need science, also values, and greater participation in decision making if we're to have our energy and nature too. And what I have pictured here is a power line corridor with some wonderful shrub scrub habitat, and that cute little bugger in the bottom left is a New England cottontail. So with that, I will pause and take any questions if there are some. And I want to say thank you very much for your attention today.
Great. Very interesting stuff, Chad. Yeah, so I guess if we want to turn on, and I'm not quite sure how to do that, Libby, if you know, turn on cameras for those in the audience. There we go. And allow you all to ask some questions. I'm going to be a little bit selfish here while people formulate their questions. I've got a bunch, if you can imagine, since I've got the mic, I'm gonna take advantage of it. So here's so much of the restriction in the regulations to do with solar has to do with this concept of core forest, what are your thoughts on, I guess the question I have, is that a good enough restriction? Is it simply that basic definition of, I forget what it is, 250 contiguous acres, or there should be some other value that goes with that the regulators can take into account? Are certain core forests more valuable than other core forests? Might some core forests be actually suitable for larger solar development while others not? And how would we get there as far as the regulatory environment?
I think it's a great question. Not included in those layers was core forest, so I didn't provide any summaries of that information. What we've found is that it's pretty rare for someone to put in a solar array in the middle of core forest, mostly because of access. And so it's difficult to get the equipment in, it's difficult to get those forest product resources out. And so I think another way that I think of it is that our forests are dynamic and they are changing in real time, and folks are making also real-time economic decisions about the opportunities that are in front of them. And when a solar developer approaches a landowner and says, hey, we can turn this, 30, 40, 50 acres, whatever it might be, they tend to be smaller than that in Connecticut, let's say 20 acres. We can turn that into a whole lot of money for you. I think it's less at that point about whether that forest is in core forest or just what that kind of money and that kind of opportunity means to a landowner. And so I don't know how to unpack that from a policy standpoint, other than to say that our siting guidelines that exist at the state level, we don't, that hasn't yet trickled down beyond the regional level and through COGS into town level, which is where some of these siting decisions and local plans of conservation and development intersect this idea of energy, people, and land.
Interesting. And is there and I sort of battle with this from a solar perspective, and so solar in Connecticut is valuable, I guess primarily as a peaking resource in the summer when it's very hot, but in the winter and on gray days like today, it doesn't work very well. So
Right.
we use the term, it's got a capacity factor of 14%, meaning it only operates at 14% of the time at what it otherwise could be operating at and under ideal conditions. So we always hear the debate whether or not it's worth it to take down 20 acres of forest for a solar facility, even in light of our increasing energy needs and the need for emission-free energy. I guess my basic question is there a certain percentage of our 65% of forest? Is there a volume number that you think would be acceptable to get to for solar given its limitations, or is it really a case by case, or is there sort of a simple way to get to, listen, we can afford to give up another 1,000 acres and not have it materially affect I'm not sure how I'm trying to say this, statewide ecology, or is there a number you would think we could get to accommodate new solar development, or is it just not a spot? Our good forest land is not a good spot for solar, just generally.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there.
Right.
And what I would say is we've done a little bit of the carbon calculations and kind of, life cycle analyses, how much carbon is sequestration and storage is removed versus offset by solar installation. What I quickly realized in that process was my skill set, my knowledge base doesn't equip me terribly well to do that. There are folks who are much better trained and equipped to provide those kinds of calculations. Some of the work that we have done is looking at the renewable portfolio standards and to say, like, what if it was all solar? What would that build out look like? And as a percentage of Connecticut, it's actually surprisingly small. Don't hold me to these numbers, but circa 5,000 acres of solar panels would meet the renewable portfolio standard. Now, I, for one, like that doesn't sound very big as a percentage of Connecticut, but that's got to land somewhere. And that 5,000 acre footprint, even if it's distributed, is still 5,000 acres. Now, does that go on rooftops? Does that go on large, utility scale? Does it go in forest? Does it go on agricultural fields? Does it go on floating solar voltaic panels? Those kinds of decisions involve economics, involve adjacent landowners, involve the landowner themselves, as well as local and state and federal entities. And so that's when I say there's a lot to unpack there. Um, but that would be what the solar footprint would be if we tried to move towards the RPS totally off of solar resources. But we know like Millstone is a substantial proportion of our energy right now, 20 to 30%. And a good portion of Millstone is going out of state to other markets as well. So there's a lot of factors that are in play here and regulations and decisions to be made about how do we accomplish the renewable portfolio standard. Um, Also recognizing it's not all going to come from solar.
Interesting. And we did get some questions in advance here, so I'm gonna start to work those down, trying to stay on this intersection with energy. One of the questions, I'm going to paraphrase it. So a lot of times, I guess, and I'm not sure what the Siting Council asks for, but you see the solar developers in the state talk about the benefit of how much carbon, I wouldn't say offsetting, but how much carbon they're not putting out versus the carbon capture value of the trees, and just sort of how much better a job the solar would do in our efforts to combat climate change than trees. Is there a better set of metrics that should be looked at just as opposed to simply, the benefit from a carbon perspective? Have you all ever thought about a model that regulators could use that look at other things, so it's not just a simple analysis like that, carbon versus carbon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my thanks to whomever submitted it. I think it needs to be a little bit broader than carbon versus carbon. And so we know that trees, forests, generally speaking, provide a lot more benefits than just carbon sequestration and storage. They're also providing water quality benefits, they're providing habitat benefits, they're providing cultural and aesthetic resources and recreation opportunities for people. Not all of those same resources are available in solar fields. I don't see anybody doing solar panel bathing, for example, like what we see with forest bathing. And we also know from a site level perspective that solar panels do increase ambient temperature, both of air and soil, and they change water resources and how they're moving in and through the landscapes where those footprints are. And so I would say, yes, it does need to be a bit broader than just carbon versus carbon, but the science needs to catch up too. We haven't fully, you can't go to the peer-reviewed literature and find a lot of support around what exactly are the changes that are happening. And so that's an area I would say we need more science, and we need more perspectives at the table to talk about that.
Right. And it looks like we do have a comment in the chat. What about solar on the landfill as a land use type, developed or grass? That's an interesting comment, because I not to get too much in the weeds here on the land use side, but I laugh sometimes at how open regulators are to brownfields and landfills without, as almost a blanket, this is a great spot for solar, but sometimes you can visit a 60 or 70-year-old cap landfill that hasn't been mowed, and it's it's a pretty nice piece of habitat. But what does solar on landfill count as, land use type, developed or grass? I mean, I could probably answer that. I think it's its own category in most states, including Connecticut. There's usually a whole separate category for land use or brownfields. Okay, so on a similar note, and this might be a little bit outside of the research you all have done, have there ever been any studies with respect to birds and whether or not they find, I'm going to paraphrase here too, whether or not they find solar fields suitable habitat, birds that are typically accustomed to being in open fields, grouse and things like that? how are they doing with 20 plus acre solar fields, or how do you think they would do?
Yeah. So way back in 2016, I took a form of a sabbatical from UConn, and I was actually a consultant for a national level consulting firm. Solar panel impacts on birds at that point in time, when my head was kind of in this space, were primarily negative. And this was because most of the development was in the west and southwestern US, where there's a lot of sunshine. And water birds in particular were mistaking the panels for bodies of water. So they were literally landing and crashing into the panels. And then on top of that, those that would survive that impact, some of them, like loons can't take off just from their feet and running. They need water to be able to get that velocity to become airborne. So I do know that that's an impact to water birds, which includes shorebirds and waterfowl. I'm much more familiar with wind energy impacts, and probably everybody on this call and in this space knows about birds and bats impacts from wind energy development. And then with respect to like ground birds, you mentioned grouse, so I think of like the greater sage grouse. We do know that the infrastructure that supports energy development does have negative impacts to sagebrush resources and then the animals that use that as well. There are some mitigating factors in the science and applied science in that space is trying to work towards, like I said at the end of my presentation, how can we have our energy and nature too?
Interesting. There's a couple more here, and I know we're getting close, but let me go through these. Oh, sort of an interesting topic that's come up. Someone wrote in, again, I'm paraphrasing their otherwise intelligently framed question here. Should we be protecting prime agricultural soils, or really be focused on protecting active farms? And I think what they're getting at is why protect prime ag soils if they're not being used for ag and they otherwise would be left there, assuming that was a mandate for a solar permit, like don't remove the soils. Like, why is there why do you think there's a restriction, or should there be a restriction on prime ag soils if there's no active farming going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the prime agricultural soils are identified through a combination of geology, historic and contemporary land use, as well as the existing conditions on the site. And so not every town in Connecticut identifies prime agricultural lands and considers them in land use decisions, including siting of renewable energy development. I live in Mansfield and I know that we do. And so there are protections for prime agricultural soils in Mansfield here. And to date, most of those are centered around housing development, less so on renewable energy development. Um, some of the factors that I think are important to consider there is that it takes a long time for prime agricultural soils to develop over time. I mean, we're talking some of it is geological time, some of it is human use of the landscape prior to European colonization. And so it takes long processes to develop those soils. So I would say in and of itself, even though they're not currently in that use, they're ready for it, so to speak. And so putting something there that might change the soil profile through either, scraping, flattening, moving soil around, really disturbs those processes that are there that can support agriculture. So I would say that's an argument for trying to keep those intact, even though they may not be actively farmed. And with respect to current farms, whether they're on prime soils or not, there's a lot of autonomy and agency around private land ownership. And I think it's important that we pay attention to it and think about there's a balance between what a landowner's rights are versus what society's needs or wants are around land ownership. And I would say as a general whole, and folks that have taken sustainable natural resources management through the MEEM program know, we're losing farms at an alarming rate. And we have been for decades, particularly small and mid-sized farm owners. And they typically are family farms. And we're losing them to larger and larger scale company farms and corporate farms. And so it's a squeezing out process. And I wouldn't quite say it's an all hands on deck to protect folks who are engaged in agricultural, um, both lifestyle and profession, but it's definitely something that's worth paying attention to.
Interesting. Okay, let me see here. There's another.
Something
It's
came
a,
up in the chat here.
yeah, it was a reference to an article showing food insecurity.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Um, one of the few major newspapers that runs a front page article, I'd say 3 or 4 times a week on things to do with the environment, which is the LA Times, had something the other day about the LA Times had something the other day about um, the wisdom of putting solar panels on I mean, these are large projects, 1,000-acre projects on farmland that was using too much water in an area of water scarcity, and saying that would have been a better use of that land, or it is a better use of that land, but given the water scarcity issues they have out there, especially in the Colorado, but it's also losing another farm and losing another domestic source of food production. Um, so here's a question: what specific impacts? Okay, it's a climate change question. What specific impacts of climate change threaten Connecticut's native plant and animal species, and how can research contribute to conservation efforts for state-specific biodiversity? And I guess maybe I'll tailor that question: are the current protections for things like forest land, core forest land, prime ag land, floodplains, wetlands, with respect to the need for, how good a job are the current regulations doing with respect to protecting those things in light of the fact that climate change is coming? And you see this, a lot when there are folks out there who think like emission-free energy at all costs, period. It doesn't matter. We need more and more and more. That's the only thing that matters. And then a lot of folks now are starting to pull back on that, saying we have to make wiser decisions in light of what's happening. I guess just any comments you have in respect to how good a job Connecticut's doing, and how research can contribute to making that better.
Yeah, a couple things come to mind. So, as illustrated in my examples, I mean, my training is as a wildlife scientist. That's all three of my degrees. But over time, I've come to appreciate and incorporate kind of the human and the lived perspective in this. Connecticut has a really rich history that extends before European colonization, and there's a strong relationship in Connecticut with waters, both fresh waters and coastal waters. And I would say those are where the climate change impacts that I see are the greatest at this point in time and have the potential to become even greater. Aspects of flooding, sea level rise, loss of our coastal salt marsh habitats. Those are very real, and those are happening. Um, and unfortunately will continue to happen. And Connecticut's also very unique, in part because of the long history um, in the state, 400 some years of Europeans being here. We do a really good job of developing around water, so much so that much of our public water is not accessible to the public because private ownership completely surrounds it. And I think about that with respect to our inland freshwaters, but also our coast. And in so doing, it doesn't leave a lot of space for nature to be nature and nature to do its thing in the face of climate change. So I think in some respects, Connecticut has done fairly well and can be very, very progressive relative to some other states with respect to climate change action. But we're also kind of playing with a deck that's a little bit stacked against us due to development patterns and human relationships with the land. And so I see that as a focal point both now and going forward, and needing more attention is to think about what can we do to increase our capacity to handle climate change going forward?
Great. I think you hit on answers on a few of the other questions that have come in with respect to your presentation. Well, I want to leave it open in case anyone I know. Thank you for emailing me your questions, to those of you who have. But I think I was instructed to keep things between 50 and an hour, and I think we're at our 50. If there's nobody else that has anything, and if you do, just chat or I guess raise your hand. But I just want to say thank you very much, Dr. Rittenhouse. This has been great. And to those of you on the call and or want to email this around to others, this presentation will be on our website in the next few days. But once again, thank you very much. That was very interesting, and we appreciate your participation.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I see Adelaide joined the call here. She's another person who's been involved with some of the programs that I operate here. She has the Sustainable Environmental Planning and Management Certificate. So if there are folks that are interested in education opportunities around environmental planning and management or energy and environmental management, certainly a Google search of me will pull up the programs that I'm involved in. Kurt is as well. He teaches a law course for us, which is absolutely fantastic. So thanks again for the opportunity. I'm very happy to have shared this. And if folks have questions further, please reach out to me by email. I'll be more than happy to follow up.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Chad.
All right. Have a good day.
You as well.